wonderful to connect. It was such a
everyone. Yes.
Yeah, it was such a lovely music as a prelude to this very important session.
Yes.
That in fact, literally, it has set the tone.
When I think this glitterati has to come, the music was matching the appropriate level of our deliberations today. So stalwarts have come, and I think big stars of academic community. So I think it matched the quality very well. So time to start now. I think 1 minute, and I'm just expecting Dr. Ratna to come.
Yeah, he's. I can see he has joined.
I am there already. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Wow.
आप आदेश करेंगे हम नहीं आएंगे तो संभव नहीं है ना.
All of a sudden I started
Excellent.
who's Dr. Ratna we are waiting for.
No, I was silently observing. I mean, my own past government, trick was paying. Be silent and watch what is happening.
So great. I think we have extremely accomplished panel today, and I'm so delighted RIS has the privilege and pleasure to hold this conversation on building post-COVID-19 economic resilience in Asia and Pacific. We are extremely delighted to have all the three speakers for this panel discussion today. RIS is privileged. We have a huge subscription for today's event. Number of confirmations, if are any indication, more than 200 people are there, and we have a huge sort of connect. So I welcome everyone, and it is from not only Asia but in many other parts of the world. We are extremely grateful for those who have connected from Africa and also from Southeast Asia. So we have good connect. This is simultaneously on other social platforms. So warm welcome to everyone. Friends, colleagues, this is an extremely important occasion for us to see how the COVID crisis is unfolding. In many parts of Southeast Asia, the challenge has multiplied manifold. Fresh lockdowns have been imposed, and there are continued challenges in terms of how governments are coping up. At several international organizations, more and more in-depth analysis and work is underway to assess the impact. The IMF just day before yesterday has come up with their own estimations, and the situation is evolving and changing so rapidly that any report which is more than 15 days ago is in a way setting its own context. So it is important for us to continuously understand the way the crisis is unfolding and also the challenges. Governments are making their own new mandates for themselves. Regional cooperation, partnerships, and financing measures are there. The recently held G20 meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors has paved way for fresh efforts in terms of building the resource base that is required. BRICS finance ministers and central bank governors have also rededicated BRICS facilities, particularly resources from the new development bank for the same purpose. At Reserve Bank of India, the bank has released the latest response to the crisis and also to the IMF report. The monetary policy, which would be announced soon, is in the making. But 3 points are absolutely clear that that have been emphasized, and I feel are extremely important. The downward revision of the growth path that India would take by IMF, I think, has to be viewed from three perspectives. The first and foremost is, of course, the multilateral action that is needed, and I think there is no substitute to it. The crisis has emphatically placed it before us. Multilateralism is the way forward, be that for addressing the inequities emanating out of vaccine distribution, but also in terms of trade and access to finance. So multilateral action is extremely important. Second point, which RIS has been raising for more than 6 months now, is the restructuring of the IMF portfolio. And this IMF portfolio, as the G20 countries have already emphasized, is important. We need liquidity in the developing countries, particularly in the South, where the emerging markets are actually the engine for world growth. And this has been proved time and again. We are the countries where the demand is emanating from. And this demand has to be nurtured, and that requires liquidity. And from that perspective, action by IMF and other multilateral financial institutions have a greater role to play. The third and extremely important is the general distribution of SDRs, and that I think is an important proposition. SDR has been one issue that we have been raising time and again, and it requires a very rational approach. It is absolutely heartening to see how trade is bouncing back, and it is largely in terms of minerals as we see, but I think it is important. Fortunately, in case of India, the monsoon is extremely kind. We are back with the higher production of pulses, oil seeds, cotton, and some other agriculture commodities. And that I think is extremely important for us to bring forward the dimensions of our engagement. And that I think is very much evident when we look into the environment, social, and governance related issues that are of great significance. The government of India already has delineated certain measures that are there. I would not get into the details, huge list of them, and fortunately some of them are well captured in the UNESCAP report that we all are here to discuss today. But it is important that the continued cooperation and synergy between the monetary institutions and the fiscal processes are important to go forward. The Reserve Bank of India has already unleashed several measures which actually have implications for our monetary policy. And as I said in the beginning, the idea of new monetary policy which RBI is working on is very much there. But the government is holding a reserve of almost 4.3 trillion. And this rupees, and these 4.3 trillion rupees that are there as a reserve give the leeway to the government for more stimulus programs. We are not in favor of giving stimulus as happened earlier during the transatlantic financial crisis. I'm not calling it a global crisis. And I think I see the smile, Shweta, eyes, and I think this is absolutely important. We need to see where we stand. But I think stimulus is required in terms of how our industry has the level playing field. Now, the continued rise in inflation, particularly on fuel cost, is something that we need to see, and that's where the government currently is now in touch with the OPEC countries. Our petroleum minister is already in touch with some of the OPEC countries to help us reduce this inflation. The agro import duties, etc., which are there, have also played an important role. And I think food security and nutritional security, particularly in a decade, which is also decade for action for SDGs for 2030 agenda, I think is extremely important for us to go forward with. The survey has brought out several important points, which I'm sure Shweta would be covering. But we had pleasure of connecting earlier when the South Asia specific consultations were held by the UNESCAP regional office, and Dr. Ratna would recall some of those meetings which we had earlier. So with these words, friends, colleagues, I once again very warmly welcome you. As I said in the beginning, this panel requires no introduction. We have Dr. Shweta Saxena, the Chief at the Macroeconomics Policy and Analysis Division of the UNESCAP in Bangkok. We have Professor Ram Upen Das, my very dear friend and former colleague at RIS. We are still working very closely. He's head of and professor at the Center for Regional Trade in Delhi and the Ministry of Commerce and Industries. Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna is now at the UNESCAP office here in Delhi, and has been part of several of the regional deliberations that are there. He has been anchoring the network for think tanks in South Asia, has done tremendous work in terms of building capacities in Afghanistan and Bhutan to bring them in the mainstream of South Asian network of think tanks. We are extremely delighted to have RIS UNESCAP partnership, which I'm sure would continue in the future. I once again very warmly welcome all of you to this meeting and would invite Dr. Shweta Saxena for her presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sachin. Actually, let me while I'm putting up my slides, let's see if it works. Can you see?
Yeah, it's there. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, just wanted to make sure. Actually, thank you so much, Sachin, for actually hosting this. And this is not my very first time at RIS. I was thinking this morning, I have had a long connection with RIS. Back in my previous life, when I was in academics, and that time Nagesh Kumar used to be the Director General, and I visited it twice as a visiting scholar during my summers back in the US, and I would come here and worked on common currency areas and those kind of issues back in the days. And the last time I remember, Sachin, it was you who hosted me in 2016 to present something that was not even a paper then, okay? Booms, crisis, and recoveries. That was just a presentation Valerie and I had done actually within the IMF, and you were so generous to actually, let me present that. It came out as a working paper, if you recall, actually in 2017 as an IMF working paper. But just to give you an update, and you should actually not feel bad that you gave me a chance to present something that was not a paper, because a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Journal of Economic Literature came to Valerie, me, and another person, Antonio Fatas, and asked us to write a review for the Journal of Economic Literature on business histories and business cycles. So an update on that one. So that paper that I presented, that was the start of this whole journey, Booms, Crisis, and Recoveries, but it's coming out as the Journal of Economic Literature paper. It's forthcoming. It's already up on their website. Yeah. So just to actually let you know, thank you so much.
Congratulations, Shweta, for this accomplishment.
Yeah.
Those of us who are in business of publication, we know the importance and relevance. Thank you and congratulations.
No, thank you so much. So before I actually get into the report a little bit, I just want to give you a sense, because not too many people know about ESCAP and what ESCAP does. So just to give you a sense, this is the regional arm for Asia and the Pacific, a United Nations arm, and where we look at all our member states, which actually the area that we cover is a lot broader than what normally is considered as Asia Pacific. So it actually goes all the way from Turkey to Kiribati and from Russia all the way down to New Zealand. But when we produce our report, which I'm going to present today to you, it normally talks a lot more about developing Asia Pacific. So it excludes Japan, Australia, and New Zealand from the Asia Pacific region, so to speak. And this has been the flagship that I lead at the UNESCAP. It has been the longest running report, not just for the UN, but actually in the region. Before actually IMF and World Bank and ADB ever produced anything, this was the only report that would at least put a economic and social scenario in front of our audience. Now, what you would find in this report, which would differ a little bit from what the IMF and the World Bank and even ADB do, basically our focus, given we are at the United Nations, is a lot more on sustainable development. So you see that word a lot more actually in our reports than you see. So we don't actually focus too much on economic growth. Like Sachin just mentioned, 2 days ago, the IMF came out with these numbers on growth, right? Actually, and that's what they do every 3 months. They produce a report card. But we tend to go a little bit beyond those numbers on economic growth to talk about what does it actually mean for sustainable development. So giving you that background, and I've been doing this for last 3 years. This is my third report at the UN. And what we've tried to do in these reports actually to push the conversation a little beyond growth. So the very first report that I wrote in 2019, Ambitions Beyond Growth, which actually talked a lot more about what are the investment needs for Asia Pacific in order to achieve the 2030 agenda. So how much more money do we need in order to fulfill all these SDGs that we have, Sustainable Development Goals? And then at the UN ESCAP, we have another division that produces a report, which is basically called the SDG Progress Report, to see how the region is doing. So in 2019, what the report cards showed was that it wasn't doing too well. Some we are doing okay, some we are not doing too well as a region. I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like how Niti Aayog and everybody produces very specific to India. We are talking about just for the Asia Pacific region altogether. And we are not doing too well on any. We are not on track to achieve any of these goals. But one of the goals that it was actually regressing on was on climate-related one on sustainable consumption and production. So last year's report focused a lot more on that aspect of it. How do you make consumption and production more sustainable? So we were talking about a stakeholder economy where you need governments, businesses, and consumers, everybody to come together. Now, given COVID was actually unfolding last year, so not surprising, the topic of this year's report is about building resilience. So because the whole idea, given so much disruption because of COVID, this resilience took a totally new meaning then. So that's why I'm going to today talk about how to actually build resilience going forward. So having said that, now you get a little bit of a background on what we do and what our report is a little bit about. So before I go in deeper into the report, let me give you the key messages. One, we all know that COVID has left and is also still leaving massive scars on the socio-economic fabric of each economy. And this impact, we believe, has been amplified because of lack of resilience and investments in people and planet. And now that the countries are starting to recover, or they're actually going to think about recovery, well, I'm not even sure how soon they'll think about it, because given the new wave of COVID coming in. But anyways, they need to actually make sure that they build resilience and invest in the 2030 agenda as they are planning their recovery processes going forward. Now, this is not the first time Asia Pacific has experienced a shock. We actually document, especially in this report, our past shocks. We've had non-economic shocks, and what the report really emphasizes is that non-economic shocks tend to have economic impacts, and economic shocks tend to have both social and environmental impact. So in essence, what it's basically trying to argue for is a more integrated risk management approach to planning and policy making. That is required, and not a very siloed approach that countries have been following so far. Now, keeping in mind all the interlinkages between economic, social, and environmental dimensions, we propose a policy package which we call Building Forward Better, that calls for investments in social services, digital access, and green development. Now, in order to actually do this, basically, you'll see you need a lot more money, of course, and although it's going to have a lot of benefits, pulling people out of poverty, reducing carbon emissions, so good for climate, good for on social aspects, and good for economy as well. A lot more jobs going to be produced. However, it requires a lot more investment, which means more money is needed, which is going to actually put a little bit pressure on the debt. So in this report, we also highlight some of the financing options. What is it that the countries could do? Having said that, so let me actually now dig into the report per se. So how we've organized it is I'm just going to give you a very little snapshot of the macroeconomic status. Given that the report was written when and some of the stuff was written basically back in March, and things are very dynamic and they keep changing. Not much has changed. Some of the things remain the same, but still, how COVID has unfolded and what the impact is on economy, social and social aspects of this COVID crisis. And then I'll take you a little bit in the past and see what kind of shocks we've had in the past and what are the lessons we've learned from them. And that puts us in a very good place to think about how to build forward a better, resilient future. So that's the kind of general structure of my talk. So we all know that actually last year, this was Asia Pacific, developing Asia Pacific's worst economic performance in a long time, when the GDP contracted by 1%, on top of a 2-year deceleration. As you can see, in 2018 and 19, growth was already coming down, but we didn't have a recession until last year. And of course, the difference between 2019 and 2020, you can see it's because basically is related to COVID. Now, COVID has imposed very significant social costs, We all know that lockdowns have, strict lockdowns have actually taken place around all countries in the region. And this has resulted in a loss of about 140 million jobs, which is, as you can see on the left-hand side, estimated by ILO. And of course, with lockdowns, many of the people who were affected a lot were basically low-income and informal workers, which means that our own estimates from ESCAP have suggested that probably about 89 million additional people could have been pushed into extreme poverty. But if you extreme poverty means actually basically we're talking about $1.90 per day poverty line. But if we raise this a little bit higher to $3.20 or $5.50, the numbers are going to be much higher. As you can see, they'll rise up to 158 million or 172 million. Now, given that there is still a lot of, at the time back in March, there was a lot of uncertainty, and there's still a lot of uncertainty. We were very cautiously optimistic at that time and believed that, Asia Pacific could actually grow by, developing Asia Pacific could grow by about 5.9% in 2021 and about 5% in 2020. And much of this big jump would actually have come from basically, as we all know, from the base effect with the deep recession. However, risks are actually tilted to the downside, and all the risks that we had highlighted back then sort of hold still. So what are those? Success of vaccination depends on speed of progress, access of different countries to vaccines, which we are seeing is quite uneven so far. And also, of course, on the willingness of people to be able to take this jab. And again, we see a lot of hesitancy in different countries. So all those things notwithstanding, that's the downside risk we had highlighted then, and it still remains. And of course, because of repeated bouts of COVID, different waves coming in, we've had lockdowns and all sorts of things. International tourism comes to a standstill. And a lot of our countries depend on the sector, especially the one that I'm living in. Actually, I'm in Bangkok, Thailand. Thailand has been severely affected thanks to these lockdowns because it's a tourism-based industry country. Now, in order to recover from this crisis, of course, governments and countries need continuous fiscal and monetary stimulus, which means there's going to be a burden on debt, and long-lasting productivity damages coming from COVID. Actually, they're going to impede a supply-side recovery as well. And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in terms of capital flows, risk of stagflation. And just 2 days, was it yesterday or 2 days ago when Fed said that it's going to start tapering sooner than expected, and we know what that means. It's going to actually have a lot more capital flows basically going in and out. So a lot of uncertainties associated with that. And of course, lingering trade tensions still actually are a big downside risk. Now, I said that, well, we had estimated that, or we had predicted at the time, forecasted that Asia Pacific will grow about 5.9% this year and 5% next year. But this recovery of 5.9 and 5% is still not going to put the countries back on their pre-pandemic trend level. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So considering this blue line, this is basically the pre-pandemic trend. So if we didn't have the pandemic, this is what output would have been. But given we have a forecasted recovery path, and this is what it looks like, which means that it is amounting to about a cumulative output loss of about $2.6 trillion. And additionally, we've calculated, according to what our forecasts were back in March, that GDP in half of these countries will be still more than 10% lower than the pre-pandemic trend level. So the scars that the economies are facing are going to be quite permanent, basically. And this is not something new. We've actually known it from some of the other earlier research, and I'll get back to that as well. Now, the worst thing is there is a big risk of a K-shaped recovery, not just within countries, but between countries as well. And we have seen this between developed countries, and they all are related to access to vaccinations, access to, and how much fiscal stimulus can be given, where a lot of fiscal stimulus has been given in developed countries compared to developing countries, which require more of it. And of course, also even within sometimes countries, developing countries, Again, there's a big difference in terms of who's benefiting and who's actually losing, depending on access to distance learning, their chances for teleworking. And so all these things mean that the recovery that we are actually going to be probably seeing is basically going to be K-shaped recovery, which means more benefits for some and less for the others. Having said that, I'm not going to dwell on this current status anymore. We are going to be doing a little bit of an update of this macroeconomic scenario by end of August. So we'll have something more to say about it then. But given I said that this is not the first time Asia Pacific has experienced a recession or a shock. We've had lots of shocks in the past, as you can see from this picture, the Asian financial crisis. We've actually had all sorts of natural disasters. We've had the pandemics before. So we thought that this is a very good time in order to take stock of things. So we need to learn something from history, because if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it again. So here we thought we'll take a look at it and see what kind of shocks Asia Pacific has experienced. So on the left-hand side, you see since the 80s and all the way to the 2000s, Asia Pacific has done pretty well in reducing the frequency of financial crises. However, on the other hand, you see that terms of trade, natural disasters, and pandemics have become more frequent. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the countries that are more vulnerable to these shocks, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Iran, Fiji, Bangladesh. They tend to have more frequent shocks. And what you will see in a minute is that why we care about shocks, and we've known it for a while, but why we care about shocks, because they tend to leave very permanent impacts. And what do I mean by that? Because all these shocks leave long-term scars and unsustainable development. So what I mean is, let's look at the left-hand side picture, which shows that after a financial crisis, investment slows down and it remains below the pre-crisis level even 5 years later. And in the middle, you see from pandemics lead to an increase in inequality as measured by Gini coefficient. And natural disasters on the right-hand side, you see, have a negative impact on environmental performance. So, and they are for all times to come. So these scars that are left are not going to be actually healed anytime soon. In fact, if we don't take care of them now, they're going to actually get worse over time. The only good thing from all the research, even I have done before, and even from this survey, the research that we did in this survey, the good news is that policy choices can reduce setbacks. So if you have fiscal stimulus, monetary and financial measures that can actually help the economy recover, countries have foreign exchange reserves, have flexible exchange rates, or access to external financing, you can recover some of the output loss. But most of the research will still show you that you cannot actually go back up to the previous trend. However, you can recover a lot of the loss. Okay. And again, some of the structural factors also help, like health and social protection systems, having good quality infrastructure, a diversified economy, good institutions. They also help in recovering some of the output loss. But a lot of the times, pre-existing structural vulnerabilities can also amplify shocks. So what do I mean actually by this? Look at this is the case for pandemics. They have had a negative impact on GDP per capita, consumption, and again, is it the health one? Yeah, human capital. But there's a difference in terms of the response from different countries depending on their structural factors. So for instance, while all of them had a negative impact, the such impact was much more muted in countries that had high public health spending, which is actually the ones I'm saying are in the blue line, high public health spending, which had formal work arrangements and had high quality infrastructure, compared to countries that are given in this brownish line, which tend to have low spending on public health, widespread vulnerable employment and low quality infrastructure. So your structure of the economy also actually determines how you're going to recover and how bad the scars are going to be. Now, from all there's a lot more rich stuff actually in the report that you can read, but after doing a lot of this empirical exercise, what we learned are 3 lessons. One lesson is we need to respond. Countries should do whatever it takes to safeguard sustainable development. So for here, supportive macroeconomic policies and external financing, along with adequate social services, they can reduce setbacks in incomes, human capital, and environment. So what the figure shows, basically, you have to take away is that it shows the potential boost you get from such policy measures compared to a too little too late scenario. So if you do the right thing at the right time and you have you do whatever it takes, that's going to be the impact on your GDP, human capital, and environment. Now, the other thing to think about is that risk management, another lesson we learned is that risk management should become part and parcel of development planning and policy making. What I mean is that policymakers should put in place effective crisis preparation and coping strategies such as early warning systems and insurance mechanisms in order to deal with all this. And lastly, we need to strengthen the resilience of least developed countries and other vulnerable countries. So what you see on this picture is different aspects of resilience, so to speak, actually, whether you look at sovereign credit ratings, exchange rate flexibility, social protection, infrastructure quality, or whatever. What you see is that least developed countries, which are in the orange line, they lag behind on all aspects of resilience compared to other developing countries, which are in the middle, in the sort of mustardish bar, or the brown one, which are the OECD countries. So it basically says that enhancing fiscal space for crisis response and addressing deficits in social and physical infrastructure, they're going to be key priorities for such countries going forward. Now, we know that a crisis is going on. We know what's happening right now. We learned some lessons from the past. So we believe that it actually puts us in a very good state to think about how do we build resilience when we go forward, when we have to think about it. Because think about, just to actually emphasize one aspect, that the recovery that we are having, we are not even sure if we can call it a recovery. We are still struggling with the COVID crisis. But whatever recovery it is, it's quite tentative, sort of. And there is a lot of pressure on governments to actually, when they start recovering, to put all their efforts back into pumping up GDP, completely forgetting about the sustainability of that growth. So we think that actually this is where we really need to actually focus. It should be on sustainable development rather than just GDP growth per se, basically. And why this is important is because we've seen that whenever you have a shock, the impact on economic, social, and environmental aspects is for all times to come. So you have to really care about what, if you're going to experience a shock, and what kind of recovery you're going to have. But before I even go into it, something I actually had mentioned at the beginning, I just want to re-emphasize this part, that the region was not on track to achieve the 2030 agenda by 2030 by the deadline, even before the pandemic. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Actually, this is a report card that our statistics division produces. What they're basically telling us that what has been the progress on all the SDGs, all the 17 SDGs, and if we were on track as a region, we would have been on that black line in the middle that you can see, the 2020 line. However, no SDG is close to that line. That means we are not on track on any. And on some of the climate related ones, like climate action, life below water, we are actually regressing as a region. And part of the reason, something I mentioned at the beginning, these are because of inadequate performance reflects investment deficits. We have not invested as much as we should have done. And this is an exercise we had done in 2019 to look at how much would it actually, how many more investments do we need in order to achieve the 2030 agenda. And these are the numbers that we came up, and most of the investments we needed at the time that we are calculated in 2019 were in people to end poverty and hunger and provide health and education. These are the orange bars, and also on planet, which is basically clean energy and climate action, and in terms of investing in biodiversity. Now, the more disappointing part is that when you look at the recovery packages that were given, there is a lot of room to integrate social and environmental issues because they were not incorporated. And that's what happens. You are in a rush, you want to just pump up growth somehow. You don't think about what the social and environmental impacts are going to be, and are we investing in the right places. So just to give you an example, just to set the stage for our Building Forward Better package. So most recovery policies that were introduced during this during 2020 were not gender specific. And what I mean is that there's a report that came out that said out of 441 policy measures introduced in 45 countries, only 57 were gender sensitive, which means these policy gender sensitive means policies benefiting women's economic security and jobs and income losses, or address the increase in unpaid care work. And on the right hand side, you see that a lot of the post pandemic fiscal resources have been used to support energy production and consumption that are channeled to fossil fuels instead of actually any kind of renewables. So this actually gives us the right time to tell you that, well, in this report, we propose a Building Forward Better policy package that consists of 3 sub-packages. One is the social services package, which means it is going to enhance access to healthcare and social protection floor. And we have a digital access package that encourages more ICT investment and more education spending on education. And lastly, green development package, which means you need to invest in energy access and efficiency, climate resilient infrastructure, and biodiversity preservation. It also includes elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and an introduction of a carbon tax. Now, we construct these scenarios, we build this model basically with 2 different spending levels. One we call the ambitious level. And what do we mean by ambitious? Ambitious means you are too ambitious, you really want to achieve all the 2030 agenda by 2030, by the deadline. And that's kind of the estimation we had done in our 2019 report. So the numbers actually come from there, how much we need to invest. But then we also look at a business as usual scenario spending level. And what does that mean? It just means it's a certain proportion of your ambitious level based on each country's past resources, but trends of financial resources. And just to give you a sense that these business as usual spending scenario basically is about 40%, 38% of the ambitious level. Having said that, if countries do what we are actually saying that if they do here, what's going to be the impact? And I am not actually giving you can look in the report that there are lots of benefits coming from on the economic side of higher GDP growth, productivity, employment, and all these. I'm not even actually concentrating on that. I'm only showing you a picture of the social and environmental benefits that the countries are going to have if they actually invest at the ambitious level. Number of poor people are going to come down by 180 million people in the long run, as you can see on the top left. Inequality is going to come down, you can see on the top right. Carbon emissions are going to fall by 30% in the long run, bottom left, and air quality will improve, as you can see on the bottom right. Now, if you cannot spend and don't spend as much as we are saying to achieve the 2030 agenda, if you do just as business as usual, of course, there are going to be benefits. The benefits are just not going to be as large. So just to give you an example, that number of poor people who will be pulled out of poverty will be about 55 million rather than 180 million. So this just gives you a sense. Of course, the more sugar you put, the sweeter it's going to be. So the more money you spend, of course, it can actually be, it can bring bigger benefits. But the one thing about doing all this is that there are big social and environmental benefits and, of course, economic benefits as well. But of course, it's going to put a lot of pressure on public debt, given you need to put money in order to first come out of the COVID crisis also and invest in this Building Forward Better package. So for Asia Pacific as a whole, you see that between 2019 and 2030, debt levels are going to go up from about 50% to about 75%. But this is going to be worse for least developed countries, where debt levels are going to actually go up much higher because of the higher investment needs that they have. So it's going to go up from about 35% to about 90%, 90% in 2030. Now, this debt sustainability analysis is quite vulnerable to what we assume about the expected economic growth. And even before the pandemic, if you recall, growth had been slowing down. As I was showing already, actually, even 2018-19 growth had been slowing. And so this shock came amidst an already slowing down scenario. So if you actually have growth that's going to be even going forward, it's going to be slower, then the implications for debt are going to be worse. So just to give you an example, that if you assume real GDP growth in 21-22 to be 1 standard deviation below the baseline, the public debt ratio will rise by 10 percentage points. And of course, slower growth will actually have implications for other stuff, which includes that it can actually lead to banking crisis and having to bail out banks, basically, which would involve sort of a fiscal support that would pose the biggest risk, public debt sustainability risk. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say that countries should not think of investing in these, because they really need this kind of a package to make sure that, you know, it's good for on social indicators, it's good for environment and everything. But of course, it's going to put a lot of pressure on debt, as I just highlighted. So where can they actually create this fiscal space? So in the survey, we give some financing options. I'll give you an example. For a lot of LDCs, their immediate challenge is to pay bank debts that are maturing, pay back debts that are maturing. So for this, we encourage countries to actually participate actively in the debt relief initiatives. And for the least developed countries, you can see on the left-hand side, basically, a lot of the debt that's owed is actually to the official bilateral or multilateral creditors for the least developed countries compared to the emerging markets. And of all the countries that are eligible to participate, among 11 countries with high distance, only 30, how many are participating? 24 are eligible, but only 10 are participating. So if actually the others also participate, there could be actually potential savings of about $1.4 billion. Now, the other thing one can go ahead and actually one can think about going forward could be about debt swaps, making debt swaps for development more meaningful, something that had been done a lot in the past, and there's been a lot of talk about it actually, making sure that creditor countries grant more generous financing requirements and debtor countries actually use those funds actually more wisely in terms of enhancing sustainable development. Now, in the coming years, of course, governments will face large fiscal deficits and higher debt. So here we suggest that LDCs to explore possible use of offshore bonds and diaspora bonds based on the country context. So just as an example, for Thailand lifted its restrictions on the issuance of unrated foreign bonds in the country, so that some of the other countries like Laos and all, they could actually issue some bonds here, because a lot of the least developed countries don't tend to have well-developed domestic bond markets. So the region as a whole can expand on these kind of things. And of course, lastly, countries need to incorporate catastrophic risk management into fiscal planning. And what we mean by this is that for very frequent catastrophes and those with limited impact, countries could rely on such instruments as government reserves, contingent funds, and budget reallocation. But for occasional catastrophes that have large impacts, countries should explore other instruments in which sovereign catastrophic risk is partially or wholly transferred, such as basically catastrophe bonds, swaps, and insurance. Now, coming to the emerging markets, they should also participate in debt restructuring, because a lot of the debt actually owed by the less developed countries is to the emerging markets, especially China. So we should actually think of considering creating a regional debt platform that involves all creditors. And of course, going forward, a lot of these emerging markets need to ensure an effective public debt management system, which is basically crucial. That means countries should adopt transparent debt reporting to show commitment to meet debt obligations and also follow international best practices. And of course, like as I mentioned earlier, they need to explore more catastrophic insurances and bonds. And of course, one of the things that's going to be very important, especially for these emerging markets, would be how to actually get a lot of this financing, that's a lot of money that's sitting out there, to be actually converted and diverted into a sustainable finance. So here we think that there is a lot of scope, basically, from a lot of money sitting, like about $7.6 trillion in assets are sitting with pension funds and sovereign wealth funds that can be directed towards sustainable development. But as you can see here, the public institutional investors, although they should step up more ESG strategies, more active use of ESG strategies, but there's lack of agreed definitions of sustainable development and transparency of companies' performance reportings. They are actually kind of reported as some of the reasons why there's not actually so much of direction of all this finance into sustainable development. So we think that to support such investing by public institutional investments, Investment rules need to be actually relaxed, and financial regulators should agree on common ESG principles and practices. So lastly, just before I actually give you the key takeaways, I want to reiterate that COVID actually has given us a unique opportunity in order to embark on a resilient and sustainable development path. Despite the many uncertainties ahead, this package offers tangible policy proposals that can help Asia Pacific countries to recover from the pandemic. So even as the outlook is optimistic, cautiously optimistic, there are risks of a K-shaped recovery. Hence, we need to prioritize a recovery that's more inclusive. And of course, going forward, policymakers need to assess the wider risk landscape that we have actually, and they should avoid both the setbacks, actually reduce setbacks, but also accelerate progress and sustainable development. And this is a perfect time to build forward better. Recovery policy packages should focus on social services, digital access, and climate action. And of course, along with domestic fiscal reforms, international cooperation and close engagement of private sector are vital. Thank you. I'll just stop here now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saxena. It was such a wonderful presentation. May I now request Professor Upendra Das to make his remark? Professor Das.
Yes, thank you. Let me begin by thanking RIS and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi and all of you in the team members to have given this opportunity to share some of my thoughts after a brilliant and comprehensive presentation by Dr. Sweta Saxena. I'm being a little formal at this stage, because it's a formal occasion, but I know Sweta since the days when she was in RIS, and this is a fascinating journey that you took us through the report, being the main author and lead author and architect of the report. It couldn't have been more timely as it is, and more relevant for the post-COVID-19 pandemic situation. I'm also very glad that the kind of emphasis that Professor Sachin Chaturvedi gave on the multilateral action, including IMF, it only complements and it actually complements to the emphasis that Dr. Sweta Saxena has already laid upon through a very rigorous qualitative and quantitative research blended with very direct application to national level policy making. I'm also very glad that Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna is also, my old friend, is also here. So I think this is really wonderful. And then being part of RIS is always wonderful. Let me begin from where the last bullet of Dr. Sweta Saxena, where she talked about international cooperation. And from there, I will begin. In the post-COVID-19 pandemic world and the economic resilience which we are trying to envisage or imagine or project, there is no denying the fact that there are different layers of policy action in the context of achieving SDGs. Just to explain what I mean is that the setting of the SDGs itself was a process within the realm of UN, which is a multilateral agency, and the targets and all the ensuing aspects of SDGs are to be implemented at the national level. So this is one aspect where the global and the national actually are interconnected to begin with. Second is, in the pursuit of achieving SDGs, the emphasis on the means of achieving those become equally important, as Dr. Sweta also has, highlighted. And it is in this context, I feel, that the global level process, which concentrated and threw open, targets in the realm of SDGs, which have to be implemented at the national level, has very important national, bilateral, regional, and global dimensions and connotations. Because it is possible, a particular country can achieve the SDGs on its own, but especially given the membership of UNESCAP, there are many economies, vulnerable economies, small economies, and even middle income economies who would perhaps not be able to achieve the SDGs just due to the national effort. And that is where their interconnectedness with other countries at the bilateral, sub-regional, regional, and also global level becomes very important. So what I'm trying to say is that within the overall context of SDG, and especially given the post-pandemic COVID-19 situation, it becomes very important to highlight what is it possible by the governments to do at the national level, where they require to collaborate. For instance, in South Asia, I'm very sure for climate change and many things, India must collaborate with a country like Nepal and Bhutan and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, and every country. And because, climate doesn't see national geographies. So my short point is that this interconnectedness and simultaneous affirmative action at different levels of national, sub-regional, regional, and global levels, that becomes very important. And COVID actually has only highlighted the importance of that. Whether it is vaccines, whether it is PPEs, whether it is ventilators, whether it is drugs and pharmaceuticals, the diagnostic kits, whether it is vaccine. If you see that COVID has highlighted the importance of this, cooperation within a nation and between nations. And it has also highlighted the problems that countries can actually get into if this cooperation is not smooth. So, for instance, even for vaccine production, if raw material has to come from somewhere else, if it is not there, then the final output is difficult. Similarly, if the vaccine has been produced, there is always a dilemma. I mean, you want to help those countries who do not have vaccine producing capabilities, like in Africa or smaller states in South Asia or UNESCAP region. But at the same time, the policy dilemma is that how can you do that while you are still grappling with vaccine availability at the national level for all your population. So what I'm trying to say is that COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the merits of international cooperation, and vaccine is just one dimension of that, our human existence. But it has also highlighted that when there is lack of cooperation, how precarious the situation can become, not only for one country, but every country in the world. And that has to be kept in mind. Now, why I wanted to emphasize on this was that I wanted to bring in the 5 international flows that determine and they enmesh the domestic with the international. It is very difficult to segregate where domestic ends and international begins and vice versa. And these 5 flows are trade in goods, trade in services, foreign direct investment, technology, and human resources, like in terms of professionals going from one place to another place, like even unskilled, people going from one place to another place. Like, for instance, in India, you have demographic dividend, but it is possible that there are segments where you have aging population, and the dependency ratio in terms of people above the working age population, dependent on the working age population, is much higher, and they require people across the skill spectrum of unskilled, semi-skilled, very skilled professionals, etc. So I think these 5 flows, trade in goods, trade in services, FDI, technology, and human resources, when I say that, it is movement of natural persons from one place to another. These are the flows which would be very critical in the post-COVID-19 pandemic era, and even during that, I would say. For instance, if a person who has to go, for instance, studying in USA is an educational service which USA exports to the rest of the world. But if the student who has got the admission does not have the vaccine which is acceptable to that country, this has the potential to become a non-tariff barrier. in the realm of a regulation which is akin to non-tariff barriers in the realm of trading goods. This will be a non-tariff regulation in the realm of services. So what I'm trying to say is that we need greater cooperation, greater mutual recognition agreement, just as we do for degrees, also for vaccines and drugs and therapeutics and diagnostics and so on. And we should also look at, and I mean, as our Prime Minister Modi ji keeps saying, and I like that we should convert the problems and the challenges into opportunity. I think this is the time where, including the UNESCAP region and other regions of the world, I would urge the policymakers to take up a challenge which is usually very difficult to confront, and that is about innovation systems. Right from the input side of innovation, which is R&D, to the output side, which is patent, and then it is commercialized, and then it becomes something meaningful. I mean, the entire spectrum of innovation. Why I'm emphasizing is this, because if you see the development index, I mean, in the material sense, you will find there is a very strong correlation between countries that are developed and also are technology leaders. So countries that are not developed or they are developing, they actually are always wanting in terms of innovation and technology, because public sector has resource constraints to fund R&D activities, and if at all it happens from the public sector. And private sector, there is no crowding in, because because of the long gestation periods, the R&D being a risky activity, and therefore ultimately the divide between developed and developing countries gets determined because of the haves and have-nots of innovation and technology. And this is what I feel, that it is very important that even in this crisis, it is important for countries to put a national innovation systems with the help of global, bilateral, and regional economic cooperation. And this very much gels with the emphasis that the new growth theories gave, and also the new trade theories gave, where technology actually provides the basis for arresting the declining marginal productivities productivities of the factors of production like capital and labor. So it is through the total factor productivity and technology and the increasing returns to scale that you actually arrest the declining marginal productivities of both capital and labor. And that's why richer countries can become richer, and the laggards will remain laggards. And the breakthrough is through technology. In the trade theory also, you see that although Ricardo and Heckscher-Ohlin and factor endowments and all those actually remain relevant, but the product differentiation, where technology actually is important. So US exports Ford cars, but also imports Toyota cars. So it's that intra-industry trade. It is essentially product differentiation or a different feel. So large part of trade which takes place today in the world is accounted for the developed world, developed to developed world, which is of intra-industry variety. And we need to understand that product differentiation, which is essentially due to innovation and technology, is very important in terms of trade, and also economies of scale. Now, economies of scale is a function of two things. Either you reap economies of scale by emphasizing on domestic market, but that is determined by per capita income. So, right. So just because one has a population does not mean that one has a huge market. So per capita income has to be the reference point for huge market. On the other hand, economies of scale you can reap by targeting those economies, maybe the developed economies, who are not into the manufacturing. They actually are, phasing out their manufacturing, and they are becoming service oriented and technology oriented economies. So you have a space to fill by having technological growth, green technology, energy efficient technologies through domestic manufacturing. But this will be possible through bilateral, regional, and international cooperation. And it will take a while for you to become, on your own. And then you cannot keep counting on your domestic market always because of size of the market constraint that is imposed by per capita income, and therefore target the high per capita economies for your export destination. So those outside pull forces of market enabled through FTA negotiations, I'm coming to that now, and your own emphasis to domestic market will give you the economies of scale, which is the second determinant of the new trade theory. And the third is imperfect market. Markets are not perfect. I mean, we know it is not a perfect market situation. So again, FTAs give you a leeway into others' markets by negotiating market access issues like tariff and non-tariff barriers and regulations on your services like H1B visa, and tomorrow it will be vaccine and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, if you go by the new growth theory, new trade theory, and tries to achieve SDGs via growth, but which is propelled through technology to have greater resources available to you, which perhaps will, in a way, help you achieve the SDGs also, because a greater availability of resources at your disposal help you, do a direct benefit transfer or, the welfare schemes and environment friendly, policies and so on. Also, because all this is essentially, focused to enhance the domestic economic activity. Now, when the domestic economic activity gets enhanced, we can, we can debate how much of employment generation took place, but you cannot deny that when the scale of activities increase, employment also increases. And in India, there is a lot of debate about whether employment has increased, the output employment coefficients and elasticities are not good. But you go to any market, any airport, any railway station, any bus station, there is, I mean, so much happening. It cannot happen unless people are busy with something. So people are getting employed and I think the Indian policymakers have unleashed opportunities for people to get employed. Yes, sometimes employability of working age population can be a problem, which through Skill India initiative I think can be tackled. So I will not go into too much of detail, but these were some of my thoughts where I thought that we can take advantage of this challenge of pandemic and focus on the entire spectrum of a national innovation system, from R&D to a commercialized technology. Focus on national efforts, but be open to international collaborations. And I think we will require both the national effort as well as international effort, so that some of the indicators that Dr. Shweta very eloquently highlighted, that the per capita debt burden in different countries should not become a problem. So we need to solve these problems without entering into the problems highlighted by the report by the UNESCAP as presented and articulated by Dr. Shweta Saxena. So I am looking at this as a something which can be a longer time horizon, but in the immediate term, I think a country like India, a country like Indonesia, a country like Thailand, a country like South Korea, even South Korea has 120 hours of wait to get an appointment to get vaccinated, now that the cases are rising. And South Korea was one of the first which actually very ably handled the pandemic. So what I'm trying to say is, sometimes national efforts may be necessary but not sufficient, and that is why I'm saying that countries like South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, and many others, I mean, I'm only focusing on ESCAP region, they should try to get hooked through comprehensive trade agreements, which includes trade in goods, trade in services, FDI flows, even technology, and provisions for mode 4 movement of natural persons without any much of restriction. And we should distinguish between people moving from one place to another place, not as permanent migration, but temporary movement, 3 years work visa, 6 months work visa, depending on the firm which hires a particular person. So these are some of my broad points, and I am very delighted to be in the company of Dr. Shweta and Dr. Rajan, and of course with Dr. Sachin and others at RIS. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you, Dr. Das, for your wonderful insights. Now, may I request Dr. Ratna to make his intervention, please?
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. Let me also join, Shweta and Dr. Ram in thanking RIS for organizing this webinar. It is indeed very timely. We do remember in partnership with our colleagues in UNESCAP Bangkok, we did a dissemination of this report for a South Asia level. But it is always good to go deeper down to the grassroots level and organize such events at a national level and outreach to many of different stakeholders. So that way, I must congratulate Shweta and RIS for this, and also Dr. Ram Upendra Das, who has been old colleague. I will not dwell upon what Shweta has said because it will be duplicating it, and then that would end up one wing of ESCAP praising another wing of ESCAP, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to bring that biasness. And so I will try to digress from what Shweta has said. But some of the points which she highlighted are very, very important, and you may find a little bit of connect between what I am saying, but within that yes, she is my colleague, but I am not saying intentionally to praise her work. We know this has been an excellent work, and we take proud in the work. Let me go a step back because we in Delhi office, which looks into South and Southwest Asia, we look into 10 countries, 8 of which are SAARC, and 2 countries are from Southwest, which is Turkey and Iran. But if you look at the dimensions of these countries, each country has its own challenge. Each country is at a different level of economic growth, and you will find everything here. You will find island country here, you will find a small island developing country here, you will find landlocked country here, you will find LDC country. 4 of the LDCs, out of them 3 are graduating in coming years. Country like India, then Iran and Turkey, and Dr. Ram was talking about, and even Shweta, when you talk about per capita, even now Bangladesh per capita perhaps is higher than India's. So those diversified nature of countries, you cannot, and we find it is very, very difficult to prescribe something which is uniform, catering to all these 10 countries. And therefore, we need to really look into and squeak and or do a little bit of tinkering in whatever prescriptions and policies we are going to prescribe. Main outlines would be what definitely Shweta has said. Professor Sachin has just said 2 days ago, IMF has come out with the forecasts. Now, I have looked at, and I have been looking at, the forecast done in 2020, then in April 2021, and now June 2021. And by December, it is going to change again because we are talking about a Delta virus. So all that what we are talking about, we need to learn a lesson and make it as a stepping stone towards a better improvement, and not going, I won't say it's a debt trap, but not going into that kind of a situation where we are all caught unaware. If you look at the sub-regional dimension, or even in the Asia Pacific, we recently, our ESCAP in Bangkok came out with the SDG progress report. And we are, or if you look at the South Asia, all these countries together, in 2020, none of these 17 goals, we are near the target for 2020. So in all, we are behind. In fact, two of the goals we are regressing as well. And therefore, in South Asia, and Professor Das also told, we are regressing in 2020 on reduced inequality, which is goal 10. We are regressing in sustainable cities and communications in goal 11. We are regressing in climate action on goal 13, despite the fact that the tremendous lockdown in 2020 improved a lot of air quality and the environmental aspect. Still, we are lagging behind. We are also regressing in life below water on goal 14 and peace, justice, and strong institutions on goal 16. Now, some of them are related to COVID. Some of them are related to our own domestic inherent legislation, policies, rules, practices, which we follow. And therefore, we all need to improve upon this, because unless in the core, and what Sweta presented, the poverty, and she was talking about 140 million population as per SCAV estimates. I mean, we did one paper last year for our own South Asia, and it was also being participated by Professor Sachin and other think tanks of South Asia. And we found from the CGE modeling that India alone in South Asia was going to be affected because of COVID. And I'm talking about 2020, I'm not talking about 2021. $118 million, 18 million population was getting into unemployment and generating into a new poor. And that raises and brings a lot of challenges in terms of economic progression of any country when you want to get into. The other challenge, which is also we found related, is the countries is struggling to come out with stimulus packages. Many countries have come out with stimulus packages. Even India has come out with stimulus packages. Bhutan there, but honestly speaking, all these stimulus packages have not been sufficient to totally neutralize the impact of COVID. And much needs to be done. But while we can demand what needs to be done, where does the government get the money? And so the financial aspect or revenue generation comes in. And SCAP, again, I'm sorry, but that is relevant, so I have to speak on that. Sweta, please forgive me that. But last 2 years has been working on how to, generate resources. Even last year, SCAP survey was on that. And pruning down how effectively the government can generate resources. It's not only the domestic resources, even external resources, internal investment. Professor Das talked about economies of scale. Activities need to be increased. Without that, it becomes very, very difficult to go for any kind of recovery or resilience or building back better. The socio-economic impact of COVID has been very severe for South Asia, especially. We have a sub-region which has the one of the largest population of the world, and global SDGs, honestly speaking, cannot be met unless South Asia meets the SDGs because of our critical weight in terms of population. And in South Asia, we found that many of the sectors were very negatively affected, and especially those belonging to micro, small, and medium enterprises. Tourism, labor-intensive exports, ready-made garments, handicrafts, they have been hit in South Asia. Billions of dollars of orders were cancelled in 2020. And we found that there are not only job losses, but there are many factories which have been closed during the COVID, and still now they have not been opened. And therefore, one of the aspects which we in this Office of Sub-Regional we talk about how regional cooperation can be used to leverage building back better. And it's not a satire, but we have two regional groupings in this region. One is SAARC, another is BIMSTEC. And many of researchers would be happy to note that in both these regional groupings, cooperation on health, cooperation on trade, cooperation on technology, economic cooperation, science and technology, everything is there. SAARC has free trade agreement, BIMSTEC has been negotiating a free trade agreement. And still, what happened in March 2020? The countries closed their borders, cross-border movement of goods, services, people were stopped. No flow of information, forget about transfer of technology or other things. Many of the countries could only open trading in essential commodities because they wanted it, but all of them ban all export of medicines and essential items. Now, if that is an emergency response to a pandemic, then we can learn much bigger lesson from such incidents, so that tomorrow, if something else or such kind of pandemic happens, what is that we are going to do in terms of regional cooperation? And thankfully, in March, the summit level talks in SAARC happened, which created a COVID fund from where the medicines and life-saving drugs and equipments were supplied within the SAARC countries. Every country, despite having their own political and other disputes and differences, they all joined hand together in COVID. And so when I look at it, I see COVID also as an opportunity, bringing certain positive momentum, because it invigorated the cooperation in health, cooperation in vaccine, cooperation in medicine within SAARC. Even BIMSTEC, the minister level talk happened in April. Much I would have desired it happening sometime in January. Exchanging information, this is happening because from January to March, many countries actually didn't know how to react to it. And that was precisely because of the lack of information, data availability, and perhaps the the effect of COVID, loss of so much human life, would have been less if not only in this sub-region, but at a global level, a free flow of information would have passed in at least countries allaying their fears and not taking all of a sudden emergency responses which affected negatively all their socio-economic framework. I mean, in India, we have seen how problem of the migrant laborers at one point of time it happened. People from Delhi, they wanted to go to Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and you could have seen the pictures at the border, how it happened from Mumbai for these people to go to their villages. But there are many lessons to be learned. And one of the lesson also which I would like and which brings the positiveness is the habit of people's lifestyle changing. You know, the global trade, investment, freight, all movements saw negative trend, but one trade aspect saw a positive trade, and that was e-commerce. Life changed. E-commerce and digital marketing brought positiveness and brought an opportunity. So as per one of the estimates, while in 2019, the e-commerce business was something around 3,600 million. In 2020, it became 4,200. And in 2021, as per estimate, it is 4,800. And by 2024, it is going to be surpassed by $6,000 billion is a global trade. So while the international trade is on pressure, but if you look innovation, if you look people adopting to technology, if you look at how people started using IT tools, it changed the lifestyle, but it also brought some of the positivity in terms of, and that is where we need to also perhaps build. IT tools have been very successfully used for vaccination, booking, tracing, tracking, everything. But also, all of that requires some money from the government. And Sweta has a prescription for that, which comes through the survey. Uh, and what we prescribe to have a greater regional cooperation, whether at a Asia Pacific level or at a sub-regional level in South Asia or with BIMSTEC or South Asia, ASEAN, BIMSTEC and ASEAN, because BIMSTEC is a bridging link. That is what we are talking about. And unless the countries move in that direction, how free flow of vaccine, information, medicines, uh, how successfully, without making any noise or publicity, Bhutan was successful in going to one of the highest rate of vaccination to their population, even to the remotest place, could bring a lot of lessons to many other countries in this region, which we can replicate. How uh, some countries successfully prevented the second wave, at least the damage which would have been done much more or would have been worse off, were controlled, could bring a better lesson to learn for the other countries. And that is where we are talking about the regional cooperation. I agree at a global level, there is no substitute to multilateralism. The UN also is one of the multilateral institutions, and that brings the sustainable development, our work towards a better life and building better. Through analytical work like what Sweta presented today, many of our research, many of our technical and capacity building works, and as what Dr. Sachin was talking about, uh, we are in collaboration with the think tanks of South Asia. We have created a South Asia network on SDGs, which was demanded by the think tanks. It was launched in December last year. It is working on. We have around 900 good practices on SDGs covering all the goals, and most of them are local, small good practices which can be replicated even at a micro level. And that is what we intend to disseminate. We are very happy to be partnering with a lot of think tanks in South Asia. RIS is one of those champions. Professor Das is our another partner who have helped in Bhutan and Afghanistan, their establishment of think tanks and training their researchers on various tools and research methodologies as to how they can support their government in bringing an evidence-based policy changes. And these are the steps which are equally important, and we thoroughly enjoy working with all of you, the think tanks in South Asia, and we'll continue to support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ratna, for wonderful intervention. Now, with all the three presentations done, we have got a list of questions, and I would like to read out some of these questions. These questions are not the audience have not marked this question to any particular panelist, so all of you are free to choose which question you want to respond to. So first, I will read out a couple of questions, and then we can go for another round. So the first question which we have got is how the global governance can be reformed to ensure more coordinated and collective response to a global pandemic, the kind of global pandemic which we are in. So this is the question which we have received from some of the participants. Then the second question is, how can multilateral cooperation and progress towards sustainable development goals be sustained in an increasingly polarized world? And the third question is pertaining to the labor market. The question is, countries in Indo-Pacific are basically dominated by informal employment. So in that situation, what kind of labor market policies are required to ensure that the unemployment effect of pandemic is minimized? Another question is regarding how Asia Pacific countries can mobilize additional financial resource to enhance fiscal space to mitigate the current challenges without compromising their debt sustainability while pursuing 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So maybe first you can address these questions, and then we can go for another round. So who would like to respond?
I'll just actually, I mean, like there were different questions about different things. Let me actually just make broad points about the questions. That'll include a little bit about that and the points that both Ramupendra and Rajan have raised, actually. I think there's no denying that we all need cooperation, international regional cooperation, but how do we get that is the real $1 million question, how to get it basically. And a lot of the times it's actually assumed or it's believed that, you know, when you're in a crisis, there is a lot more willingness to cooperate. But the moment you go away from the crisis a little bit, actually that willingness goes away. So how to maintain that? And there are different ways of actually, I mean, like, you know, keeping to, I think one of the examples that Rajan had given was very nice one about how SAARC has created this little COVID fund, basically, like, you know, in case it happens again, we have something to dip into right away, basically. So those are some of the ways they can do it. Now, my bigger question actually is that a lot of the times I presented that I think one of the questions came was how to create fiscal space without jeopardizing your debt sustainability, right? That's one of the things. And I think creating fiscal space is not that hard. A lot of the times countries do tend to believe that it's actually literally taxing more. I mean, like literally taxing people more so that you get more tax revenues that you can spend. But within the envelope that you have, you can do a lot. You can actually improve the efficiency of your already current spending, which tends to be very low in a lot of the developing countries. Even in our 2019 report, we had found that you can actually, in education and health, I think you can produce the same outcomes with 30% less resources, fewer resources, which means it's an efficiency argument there. Basically, you can improve the efficiency within the same envelope. You can actually do that. So you can create fiscal space without having to expand the fiscal space and get into debt issues. That's one way. And right now, one of the ways to make sure that when we are recovering from this crisis, we actually do tend to move towards the 2030 agenda is to make sure that whatever we are working on basically is in line with those. Okay. So just as an example, I mean, like, you know, why would you, I know it's been a very hot issue in India, actually, oil prices going up, and it's always a political issue. Chile and France actually had riots, and actually, you know, the Jean Genet coming on the streets. I mean, like all these things happen, basically. I understand that. But what does it mean, actually, oil prices going up? Should the government subsidize it actually so that we don't have the riots, or should we actually try to let the oil prices be what they are, the micro prices, and actually try to encourage actually more innovation in renewables? Should we take this as an opportunity, as Ramupendra was saying? We should take this as an opportunity for innovation in R&D and all these things, right? Ramupendra, you were the one who was arguing for those kind of things. And so what is the appropriate response? I mean, like, you know, and a lot of policymakers, they tend to get into this short-term political thing, right? Basically, they might have elections around the corner and they might lose, so they might actually want to do the wrong thing of actually subsidizing it. I think when prices rise, a lot of the times people learn to actually innovate in ways to kind of get around it. That's what happened actually back in the 70s when we had gas guzzlers, and there were two oil crises that happened in the 70s. What did we actually see? Those gas guzzlers went away, and Japan was very innovative in terms of actually bringing these very fuel efficient cars, right? That was one way of dealing with those high oil prices, right? And right now, I think the best way to go about it is, we know we have to move away from fossil fuel anyways. We might as well actually go into renewables. So spending money on energy means spending it on renewable rather than on this. So that's one way of actually literally staying whatever you need to spend. You had $100 you want to spend, just spend it in the one that's actually, just look at the SDGs. There are markers there. I mean, like, it's very easy to do that. And some of the other things India has already done in the past, and it can do more actually by providing, trying to actually fulfill on the mandates of the SDGs by providing clean fuel. Okay, having providing toilets and all those things which are health related, and all those kind of things. So you can still work within that same envelope, but work towards those issues that are actually more pressing, and you can save that. So one of the ways literally of building fiscal space is not necessarily to expand your fiscal resource, but actually to literally see where is it that you're going to get the, as we say, more bang for your buck. Okay, so that's one thing I really want to say. Now, in terms of region, I think one of the lessons learned also, it's quite interesting. I think whichever policies I'm going to say, I don't think anybody can argue that we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't spend more on health. We shouldn't spend more on this and that, right? Actually, these are these motherhood and apple pie, right? Like, nobody can deny that, you don't work on this. Right before this seminar, I was having a call with somebody at the Council of Economic Policies, and we were talking about it. And he said to me, well, how I think about how to change the scenario is by actually changing the paradigm. And basically thinking in a different way. Is efficiency that important, or resilience more important, right? Actually going back to the basics of basically how economics comes about. Okay, should we actually continue to rely on selfish economic agents, or do we want actually people to be thinking a little bit more in an altruistic way, right? Those are the basics of economics that you can question and then come up with the policies. But even if you don't think of it in that way, you can come up with the policies. So the point is, do you want the economic paradigm to change, or do you want just the policies to be implemented? And I think most people will agree with the kind of policies we need. But why don't those policies happen? Because the thinking still remains in terms of short-term thinking on, let's actually get the growth going, let's actually care about efficiency, let's be selfish, and just actually everybody working in selfish way will attain a bigger, better global good. And I think there is an issue here. Unless and until you start to think in a different manner of what we really want, you're never going to have the, although we all agree on policies, but those policies will never be instituted. And I think that person was saying, because he always had this thing about, do we really need to change the paradigm, or do we just change the economic policies, which all agrees with. I think all the policies I said, did anybody disagree with the fact that you have to actually invest in green stuff, digital stuff, and social services? No, not at all. But it's the thinking. Okay, it's about the thinking. Actually coming back to actually how to get more money invested in SDGs. One of the arguments I made actually was about how we really need $7.6 trillion sitting with pension funds, also sovereign wealth funds. Why doesn't it actually flow into SDGs? Part of the reason is because we don't know what is green, what is social, what is good, right? Basically, right? So the definitions on ESGs, they're not very clear, right? So if we don't have those definitions being clear, actually people are not going to invest. So some things that we can do very easily in order to come up with a standard of what actually is green, and people can start investing in it, basically, right? Those are the things we can do. But the other part, actually, again, in this entire spectrum, I still was reading an article this morning from Moral Money on FT. It's always about, you have to start taking account of all the externalities when you calculate your profit, which means the environmental damage you're doing and what happens to social aspects of society. You need to take account of that. But interestingly enough, everybody keeps actually saying that, you know what, you can actually continue to give your shareholders a big return even if you invest in ESG. And that's a lie. There has to be a trade-off. And unless you understand that there's going to be a trade-off between actually that much return and some kind of environmental and social benefit, I think we are not talking on the right, on the same plane. I mean, like, nothing is ever going to get done. If you continue to tell investors you're going to get the same kind of returns we did when we were actually doing fossil fuel, and then you're going to get the same returns, actually probably even higher if we actually go into renewables and we pay everybody a living wage. I think this is lying to people, actually. So it is not changing people's attitudes and their thinking about what kind of a world do we want to live in. And I really have a problem when people don't understand that there is going to be a trade-off, a little bit of a trade-off. And we need to decide as a society, as a nation, as international, you know, community, what is it? What kind of a future do we want to see? So this will always remain a problem unless and until we really face these head on. Lots of things that can be done within the same budget envelope. Actually, one of the questions was asking, and I think that's right on the mark. You don't need more money to do lots of things. You can do within the same. Okay. And if you actually can think how you can do everything in a green way and in a sustainable way within the same budget, it's possible and it can be done. I think India has already shown that it can actually do it basically without expending too much of fiscal space. By actually working on some of the SDG goals, we can go further also, and other countries can do the same. I'll end here actually. Ramupendra and Rajan, I'll let you to complain about the fact that you don't want to change in paradigm. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks, Shweta, and Pankaj, thanks for those very important questions. And Shweta, you have only amplified in your answers the wider issues that underlie um, or maybe are causal factors for the miseries of the world and people at large. I mean, and when I say world, it includes human beings and a life which is beyond human beings as well, our flora and fauna, everything. So if I really make it very simple, a very complicated subject, simple, because sometimes I feel that it is important to be very simple and straightforward. I have a feeling that whether it is India or US, whether it is Paris or Thailand, Bangkok, I mean, you can be in Male or you can be in somewhere in Nairobi. One thing I have realized that the nature of problems that afflict human beings and the responses thereof by human beings at different levels, whether you drive an auto rickshaw or you are actually a political master driving the country, whether you are driving an economy or you are driving a course in a sociology course in a university, whether you are in private sector or you are in public sector, whether you are possessing a labor skill or you are possessing capital or technology. The problem is that the technical dimensions of human existence have not been blended with the moral and ethical tenets to the extent that they are required. And that is why sometimes good policies are not implemented. Sometimes bad policies are implemented too well to cause misery to the world. And therefore, anyone who is doing economics or political economy, politics, teachers, student, everywhere I see the problem is same. I mean, you can have problems in Indian Parliament, but you can also have problems at Capitol Hill, in January. So what I'm trying to say is that while one would have developed in terms of a materialistic ladder, one would be qualified to be called as this country or this country or this country, and some are at different levels of the ladder. The human beings are same. You can change the system of former Soviet Union, you can have capitalism, you can have market socialism, you can do, there are very wonderful private sector people who do very well. I mean, they take care of themselves, they take care of their employees, they take care of the societies also. But then there are those who will run away with the money. there are a lot of good politicians who just do good to people, and there are economic policies that they implement which make changes in the lives and livelihoods of people. But then there are those who are actually just not interested in this. So I am trying to, bringing all dimensions, because SDG, if you see SDG, it has an overall existence of human beings actually encapsulated in those, numbers uh, of SDGs. And therefore, I feel that be it national responses or within nation, regional responses, I mean, in a federal setup, the federal, sub-federal levels. And also, if you go beyond at the global level and in between the regional and bilateral, I feel that wherever there are people, human beings, be it in private or public, politician or economies, wherever they are blending the ethics and the morality of doing the right thing, just as maybe, I mean, you can be inspired by anyone for that. There is no dearth of knowledge how to work correctly and do well for others as well as yourself. There is no dearth of knowledge in that. I think people are not referring to that. People are, as you very rightly said, people are interested in short-term gains. They are only thinking of themselves. On the other hand, we have important references where people are looking at long-term. People are taking others along. So we have both the examples. And somehow I am an optimistic person, though the world looks like very pessimistic. But I think this is also, it is a business cycle of God, where crests and troughs one has to pass through. And I am very optimistic that one day more people with greater positive value systems will be at different important places, and everybody's lives beyond their human existence, including the flora and fauna, will also change for the better. So that is my answer. If we cannot tackle this, whether it is G20 or BRICS or UN or IMF, nothing will happen. Thank you.
Exactly. Can I just add before Rajan goes, actually, because just to add to what Ramu Benda just said, I'm quite optimistic too. I'm an optimistic person, by the way, actually. So I do believe that, I do believe in the good in people and they will do the right thing. But my only worry is always this, the 3-month report card on GDP growth, which doesn't measure anything substantial, but gives the fodder to opposition everywhere around the world to kind of go and haunt the prevailing governments into actually submitting to the fact that you've got to do something quick and dirty to actually raise this growth up, right? And sustainability takes time, right? It's not necessarily that it's very easy to just subsidize the oil prices right now and get your GDP go up. Actually, again, all sorts of things can happen in no time. And is it going to be good in the long run? Perhaps not. But the short run, yes. If there's too much pressure, it can actually. So my point is, and this is what worries me the most about all these international organizations, that every 3 months they come with a report card on every country, forcing countries to take short-term measures rather than longer-term measures of sustainability. And that's where I'll end.
Dr. Ratna, would you like to add?
Okay, quickly, 2-3 points on a lot of on the funding and budgeting part. Even Sweta has clarified on some of the questions. I would just like to share one of our experiences. As I was saying, last year we came out with a report on socio-economic response to COVID and looking into the national strategies and regional cooperation. It was also based on a survey, and we got around 400 people respond to it. And one of the questions was that for stimulus packages, the government has to bring funds. So from where you think the funds can come? And the options which we gave was introduce new taxes, reduce the expenditure of the government, use it more judiciously, take it from the donor, bring it from external resources and others. And this was done for South Asia, so it's not India centric. And the least preferred preference was imposing new taxes. but natural, nobody at that moment of time, and this survey was done sometime in April 2020, so it was just a very beginning of the COVID. But I mean, if you ask, we all are consumers at one point of time or are taxpayers, and nobody was willing, because they were anticipating perhaps that the government requires money and it will pay tax. But interestingly, all of them were unison on number one. The top was, and that is what I wanted to supplement Sweta. They said that the government expenditure need to be disciplined. It need to be judiciously spent, and they felt, the comments came that they see that the the burden of the budget of the government on itself is very, very high, which needs to be pruned down. I mean, I just wanted to share to supplement what Shweta has stated. But this came out of survey, and that was a very interesting perception of people thinking about the government practices. I entirely agree. The stimulus packages or diverting the entire money towards health. Today in India, for 130 crore people, which means 260 crore vaccines. Even if 100 rupees is the cost or a 50 rupees is the cost of one vaccine, you imagine how much money government is paying to these vaccine making companies. Where will the money come from? As a citizen, we all want free vaccine, but we are not ready to contribute to the government for the taxes. So where will the government tax the money? Where will you get the money from? It has the social obligation to meet, and that is what I agree with Ram Upendraji when he said every policy of the government, good or bad, it has to be people-centric. If you forget that aspect, you purely look from materialistic point of view, I think that's a bad policy. But anyhow, thank you. No, I don't want to take more time.
Can I just
No,
add
just
one thing to
yeah.
what Rajan just said? Actually, just one thing.
Sure,
This
sure.
is very true. People don't like taxes, but people don't like general taxes. People don't mind if taxes are very specific. Like, if you say, like a lot of research actually in this area has been done, which shows that when taxes are for specific purpose, when they know where this money is going, okay? So like social security taxes in the US, people are more willing to actually give those taxes because they know exactly what it will be used for. But general taxes, of course, nobody wants to actually pay. Everybody wants the benefits, but no taxes. But I just wanted to make that point here.
Yes, no, you are very right. In fact, almost similar point I wanted to make, but it had two dimensions. One was that exactly as Professor Ratna has also mentioned, people don't realize what government is doing when actually government is people-centric. Now, the moment you are, assured that you will be getting free vaccine, you have forgotten that you are not going to spend money. But before that, if it were to be procured and a price X was to be paid for 1 unit of vaccine, that price itself was a debatable issue. But the moment it has become free, people forget. I mean, that is what I'm trying to say is that the problem is all of us. I mean, we as human beings, and in all actions, it comes out. Second is, as Dr. Sweta has mentioned, that same set of people, I mean, it is a paradox. Same set of people display the highest value system and the model code of conduct when the taxes are actually task or purpose specific. So even in Indian case, you have an education cess. You have, so what I'm trying to say is that when you have a targeted, tax, nobody even discusses that this is a burden. Even if the proportion can be actually taxing, but you know that this is the purpose for which it is going. So this is also a paradox, which is also a source of my optimism, that when I say that people are not doing what they should be doing, which makes me pessimistic, I also see the same very people doing in different circumstances or in different case exactly something which is really warranted at that point of time. And people don't then acknowledge that they have really done it, so well. So this paradox of human behavior is a source of my optimism, that I think more and more these positive, examples will get just generalized. And just to highlight how G20 came to the rescue of those who actually contributed to the 2008 financial crisis, and they bailed out everyone who were struggling. And now G20 has not done even that much what India's leadership in SARC has done. Now that is the level of philosophical existence in terms of handling a concrete problem, where our leadership here in region, despite all the political problems in the world, did something in its modest means which G20 has not been able to. There is no G20 fund for COVID, and that is deplorable. But they all came together. They bailed out, the Wall Street and other multilateral institutions in the aftermath of 2008 crisis. So that's for the global action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Das. There are a few more questions, but we have already exceeded the time limit. And since Shweta is joining from Bangkok, so it might be getting really late for her. So I would refrain from taking more questions, and would like to thank all the three panelists for this wonderful discussion. I know that it can go on and on and on because it has been so interesting. But as they say that all good things come to an end, so this wonderful panel discussion has also come to an end, and I would like to thank all the three eminent panelists for their wonderful thoughts, for taking time out of their busy schedule and participating here. And I would also like to thank our DG, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, who set the tone of this wonderful panel discussion. I would also like to thank my colleagues in our DG office and IT team who have put in a lot of effort to organize this panel discussion. And finally, I would also like to thank all the panelists, so all the participants who join in a huge number from all over the world. So thank you very much, participants, for making this panel discussion lively and very informative. So once again, thank you, Professor Das, thank you, Professor Dr. Ratna, thank you, Shweta, for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pankaj, for organizing and inviting me. As I said, that I've had a long relationship with RIS, and it's always good to be back with RIS. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj, for to you also to moderate and give us the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Shweta. Thank you, Rajanji. And thank you, everyone at RIS. I mean, without Cisco WebEx also, I'm connected with RIS. Thank you, Pankaj.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I look forward to remaining in touch. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.